for the fourth in our seminar series of Education, Purpose and Human Flourishing in Uncertain Times. Tonight, things are running a little differently, partly because of Professor VanderWeele's teaching schedule. As indicated in the email, Dr. David Johnson is going to start the conversation, and then Tyler VanderWeele himself will be joining us shortly. In the meantime, I hope you got to see the video that we circulated in the email. Dr. David Johnson, who's a co-convener with myself and Ms. Luana de Borst, is a reader in comparative and international education here at the University of Oxford. He convenes the Centre for Comparative and International Education. He is a chartered educational psychologist who studies learning and cognition and is particularly interested in tracking learning progression in national systems of education over time. Recent work includes time series studies of learning in Sierra Leone, Nigeria, and Sudan. Professor Tyler VanderWeele, who will be joining us shortly, is the John L. Loeb and Francis Lehman Loeb Professor of Epidemiology in the Departments of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at the Harvard T. Chan School of Public Health and Director of the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard University. He holds degrees from the University of Oxford, University of Pennsylvania, and Harvard University in mathematics, philosophy, theology, finance, and biostatistics. His empirical research spans psychiatric and social epidemiology, the science of happiness and flourishing, and the study of religion and health. He's published over 300 papers in peer-reviewed journals, and he also writes a monthly blog posting on topics related to human flourishing for Psychology Today. I'd like to pass the microphone over to Dr. David Johnson.
Hi, Fiona. Thanks very much. Evening all. So always a hard thing to do to try and summarize a paper of a fellow academic who may not have much time tonight to defend himself if I were to pick an argument with his paper. So I'll try to be really to raise for you some of the things I hope you'll have seen in the video, and just to pose a few questions. There are probably many more themes and topics that Tyler wanted to drive home. How long do we have, Fiona, for this? Until Tyler joins?
Yeah, until Tyler joins, about 20 minutes.
About 20 minutes. All right, will you just keep me on in harness, please, and let me know. All right, so look, I think Tyler probably wanted to drive home a number of important points, and I may be picking up on, well, certainly not all of them, and I may be emphasizing ones that he thinks are less important to emphasize. But you'll have seen from the video, he poses the question, what is flourishing, at the beginning, and of course says that there are different visions of what flourishing is. And a lot of these, what he calls grand visions from the World Health Organization, the World Bank, perhaps, OECD, people with a strong inclination for economic satisfaction, economic national prosperity, like the OECD. I mean, many people in education know the OECD from its PISA studies, but it's really an organization funded by European countries to look into a number of things, including their tax contributions or their security and so on. But essentially, it is what it is, an organization for economic cooperation and development. And PISA is a bit of a side show. The fact that they've got involved in it is a different sort of debate that we'll have at a different sort of time. But these organizations, like the World Health Organization or the OECD, or interestingly, economic well-being and prosperity, will put in place visions and attempt to achieve commonness. So for the OECD particularly, across European countries. What does prosperity, national prosperity, mean, and what do you do in order to drive that? And then, of course, he talks of positive psychology and really a sense. Even I've downloaded a little app on my phone called Mindfulness that reminds me every morning that I need to answer a few questions, or it asks me how I'm feeling. And as a psychologist myself, this is very psychological. This is very much me. As me. But as as somebody who thinks of global and world politics, then actually how I feel this morning, and have I taken a deep breath or two, is not really quite the predominant concern. So there are questions really, but for Tyler, I suppose the question is, and it's a good one, is there a relationship between these grand visions and what we know and can find out through empirical study? So he poses a question, and as I said, I think it's a good one. All the studies that we have conducted seem to be studies of a smaller scale. These are individual pieces of work that try and answer questions on health and well-being. He talks later of, do you smoke? Have you stopped smoking? And so on. And there are countless surveys of this kind, or indeed in his indices, he talks of economic measures and, how worried are you if you haven't paid the rent, or how often does this happen? And on the whole, these are smaller scale studies that don't quite match, if you like, the grand vision. And I think that's a point he makes very, very well. The second in his presentation is really definitional. And Tyler looks at this, and certainly for Harvard and the institution there, it seems that they have locked into a definition that says flourishing is a state in which all aspects of a person's life is good. And I have to say, I had to take a walk and come back and think again on it, and wondered whether actually, in definitional terms, is this possible? Is it achievable? We can think of all sorts of definitions of what flourishing is and what it means. And I looked at the definition that Tyler asks us to look at, and the question for me really is it indeed possible? But not only is it possible, I suppose, in an uneven world? Is it possible in an unstable world? Is it possible in a world where pluralism often, for some mean plenty, and for others mean very, very little? It's certainly a question that I would like to ask when Tyler appears. And he then moves on to a third element in his paper, which he calls consensus, a search for consensus. And it's absolutely right that we should search for consensus, and he uses, in a sense, two ideals, if you like, a desire, a number of elements. So we might all desire to obtain a particular personal state, or states in which are indeed ends in themselves. wealth or prosperity, good, strong family ties, and good health and personal well-being, and so on. And again, I suppose for me, the questions are that, absolutely, as researchers and academics and people who think on the question, we should try to arrive at some kind of consensus of what flourishing means and how obtainable it is. But we have to, in doing so, sort of understand that the world is in itself a little unstable, and therefore consensus is not perhaps necessarily achievable. So many years ago, I've worked on questions of security, global terrorism, and others, and you take a broad view of the world and wonder, what inspires a sense of violence, how different cultures or communities think on life, what is, and for the importance of life. Is protection of life in a sense the ideal protection at all costs, or is sort of taking life in a sense an important ideal, so that balance can be achieved. But I only say so in that we must be reminded that we don't live in a world where consensus is necessarily achievable. We live in a world in which consensus, where ideas and ideals and questions of well-being, state of mind, prosperity, happiness, or flourishing are contested notions. And so the idea that we can develop a sort of spectrum of visions, a spectrum of ideal states, and call this a consensus, I think really does need probing, and it does need probing if my proposition that the world we live in, the global world, the world we live in today, whether local or whether globally, is a world in which contestation is a key feature. People don't necessarily agree about what is important and how to achieve it. And so of course, Tyler then goes on to talk of measurement of flourishing scales, and these are useful and interesting, and there are 10 or 12 scales, Likert type or 10-point scales, in which you might sort of fill out a questionnaire and sort of how do you feel today, and so on. And of course this is important. And of course it's important when such matrices are used well in thoughtful and in considered studies. But again, I'd be doubtful if what we can achieve academically, whether as entirely a global epidemiologist or a global psychologist or political science sort of figure, are one-time measures that may or may not be picked up. So it's not that one-time measures are unimportant, or that 2 or 3 time measures are important in themselves. It is again sort of trying to bring into the fore the idea that we live in a world that changes rapidly, and that those changes aren't necessarily in one direction, that those changes are vicissitudes, that those changes are, sometimes have swings like pendulums. So we know that certain societies have economic upturns and economic downturns, and in an economic downturn in a particular society, whether it's the US or Britain or South Africa or whatever, then how people feel about themselves and what they do in order to achieve a state of well-being certainly changes and is different in an economic upturn than it is in an economic downturn. In economic upturns, we're probably a little more tolerant of our neighbors, particularly if they speak in a different kind of accent to